Joining me now is Acting Homeland Security Secretary Chad Wolf. Good morning, Mr. Secretary. You have authority over about 600 law enforcement personnel from ICE, Secret Service, Border Patrol, assisting with law enforcement here in D.C. Do you believe a heavy security presence is still necessary?
Well, thank you for having me this morning, Martha. What I can tell you is that the Department of Homeland Security and our law enforcement officers are in support with the Department of Justice of making sure that we address the violence that has occurred there in D.C. over the past week or so. So we'll continue to do that. As you indicated, we've had up to 300, 400, 500, 600 folks there in D.C. And what we saw over the past week is really a city out of control. And I'm happy to say that over the last several days, we've seen that violence decrease. But that's been as a result of what the administration has done in D.C., working throughout the federal government, not only with DHS assets, Park Police, and Metropolitan Police Department with D.C. as well. That violence has decreased, and we're happy about that. So we'll continue to monitor that, and we'll pull back the number of assets that we have in D.C. As that violence decreases, so that, again, lawful protesters, protesters exercising their First Amendment can continue to have their voices heard.
You say a city out of control. Certainly yesterday was very peaceful and many days before that. But I want to turn to earlier this week. The president talked repeatedly about dominating the streets, bringing in heavily armed military, vicious dogs if the police can't get the job done. Secretary of Defense called American streets a battle space. He walked that back later. And while there was inexcusable criminal looting that happened, the vast majority of the protests have been peaceful, including yesterday. So what kind of message do those words send to your officers when they come face to face with their fellow Americans demonstrating on the streets?
Well, I think what we have to do, and you mentioned it, Martha, there's two different populations here, two different sets of protesters and rioters, for that matter. So I think we have to separate that. Obviously, we have peaceful protest, and again, individuals exercising their First Amendment. The Department of Homeland Security, as well as others, are going to do everything to protect their right to do that. But what we've seen is you have violent protesters infiltrating and hijacking those protests that are becoming very violent that we saw earlier this week. And so what we've done and what the president has been very clear on is we're not going to let that stand. We're going to bring law and order back to the streets of D.C. and any other metropolitan area. And we saw that. We saw churches on fire. We saw monuments being defaced. And the president's not going to stand for that. So we'll continue to push forward. But again, as you indicated, over the last several days, we've seen that violence decrease, and that's where we want it to be. We want to let peaceful protesters provide that environment for them to exercise their First Amendment. But at the end of the day, this is about law and order. This is a country built on law and order, and we're going to address those protesters that are destroying businesses, that are targeting law enforcement officers. We can't have that go on day after day.
There have not been too many examples in the last few days. Now, look, the law enforcement is a difficult job, and there were senseless acts of violence against some officers, certainly establishments as well. But these protests were prompted because of the violent death of George Floyd by police officers. And there's now fresh outrage because of the way some of those protesters have been treated by law enforcement. I want to show you just a few examples.
Now you see what's going on now. Now there's just a lot of violence.
What is your reaction to that, Mr. Secretary?
Just north of the White House here.
Well, let me first say that the outrage that Americans are feeling today about the death of George Floyd is very real, it's very legitimate, and we need to address that. And I think the president has been very clear about that. We need to make sure that those that are responsible are held accountable, brought to justice, and we are doing just that. And I think you've seen the justice system move pretty quickly on that front. All those police officers have been arrested and charges have been filed. So I think we need to state that first and foremost. But again, what we see across the board, by and large, is law enforcement doing their job. Yes, there are individuals in every profession that are perhaps criminals, that are perhaps abusing their authority, and we need to address that. And again, we've been very.
But how do you address that when you look at those images?
Let me just say that for DHS, this hits home. We had a federal protective officer last Friday, over a week ago, targeted and assassinated, shot in the head as he's responding to a protest. So this hits very close to home for the Department of Homeland Security. So when we talk about attacks on law enforcement, it's not an abstract idea. We are seeing them being targeted, and we need to make sure that the violence that's going on in cities across America, and again, it's diminished, I acknowledge that, it does not continue. And so that's a real concern that law enforcement who are sent out there and do their job every day, protecting the American people every day, they have a right to do their job and to go home back to their families safe.
Mr. Secretary, those are indeed terrible examples, but I want to go back to the examples I showed you. Do those disturb you? These are public servants who are trained to supposedly meet protesters, not beat them up.
Absolutely. So again, as I indicated, I think you need to make sure that all law enforcement is acting correctly, or doing their jobs correctly, and when they're not, they need to be held accountable. So some of the images that you showed, as well as others, we need to make sure that we investigate. And again, if the evidence shows that they did not do their job correctly, they did not do the way they were trained to do, we need to hold them accountable. That's what we're doing in the George Floyd case. Again, the president has directed the Department of Justice to launch a civil rights investigation there. So there's a number of steps we're doing. We'll continue to do that. I think we can always do better. We can do more. But again, we need to also focus, while we're focusing on some of the police, we also need to focus on what has occurred over the last week in cities across America, burning churches, defacing monuments. We cannot let that go on. And so I think as we talk about what the police is doing, we also need to talk about what they're up against every day as well.
And Mr. Secretary, George Floyd isn't the only Black American who was killed by police. In fact, Black Americans are killed by police at more than twice the rate of white Americans. An Axios Ipsos poll found 77% of whites say they trust local police, compared with 36% of African Americans. Do you think there is a problem with systemic racism in policing in the United States?
I do not think that we have a systemic racism problem with law enforcement officers across this country. Do I acknowledge that there are some law enforcement officers that abuse their job? Yes. And again, we need to hold those accountable. And I would say that there are individuals in every profession across this country that probably abuse their authority and their power, and we need to hold them accountable. Can we do better? Can we do more? Can we continue to do more in the law enforcement arena, outreach to our communities, particularly those that feel slighted or absolutely. And so I think there's always things that we can do more. But again, I think painting law enforcement with a broad brush of systemic racism is really a disservice to the men and women who put on the badge, the uniform every day, risk their lives every day to protect the American people, to protect them so that they can go to school, they can have a business, and come home safe to their families. So I think we need to keep that in mind as well.
Thank you very much for joining us this morning, Mr. Secretary. Appreciate it.